thank you for joining us this morning for the latest in our GeoTalks Express series, number 17. I was counting this morning, number 17. Today's session is going to be on the topic of map publishing. We're going to talk about how a method of sharing data from Global Mapper. Now, publishing can be used in a number of different contexts. We, in one of our previous sessions, had talked about web publishing. Today, we're specifically going to be talking about preparing a map for printing. It might seem a little old school, but it's still very relevant for a lot of folks, being able to print a map or even generate a map as a PDF. We've got a few different scenarios we're going to go through to illustrate this process in Global Mapper. I'm joined this morning by Mackenzie Mills. Good morning, Mackenzie.
Good morning, David. How are you today?
I'm great. You sound bright and cheery. That's great. Enthusiastic about today's content, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah.
Excellent, excellent. So Mackenzie and I are going to be using the same machine to kind of tag team a little bit. So it may seem a little bit, a little bit disjointed sometimes. We'll do our best. We'll do our best to guide you through the tools that we're going to be covering as far as map publishing is concerned. Before we begin, usual housekeeping issues. There are, with all of our sessions, still folks who are new. Great to have folks who have maybe not been in our previous sessions. Let me remind you, for those who've been here before, or tell you for those who are new, the format that we're delivering here. This is obviously a one-way communication process. You're able to hear myself, you're able to hear Mackenzie. We can't hear you. So you're in listen-only mode. The questions panel that you should be seeing on the right side of your screen will give you an opportunity to ask any questions that you want of us in real time. Mackenzie and I will be looking at that. I've got a big window on my second monitor with all of those questions as they come in. We will try to answer those in real time as we can. If we get a little overwhelmed, we may not be able to answer all of them. We will follow up with all of the questions. We will answer you directly. We will also post the questions on a blog. Usually we do that within a few days, and you'll see the questions and answers. We'll send you an email with that link again a few days from now. Session is being recorded, so you will have opportunity to revisit some of these workflows, maybe even share it with your colleagues, your friends, whatever. So you'll have a recording, a link to the recording. I should also mention, for those of you who are new, these recordings are on a playlist on YouTube, and when you get the link that we'll send you in a few days, you can go back and look at all of the previous sessions as well. You have access to the previous recording. So nothing to do this weekend. There's your playlist set up for you. We have a few more this year. We're kind of winding down the 2020 season. We will be ramping up again in the new year. I'm going to talk about that in just a second. But for the last of our sessions for 2020, Katrina, you've heard in our previous sessions, is going to be working with one of our partners to introduce this idea of holographic view, creating a holographic view of your data from Global Mapper using the Ada platform. Now, to be honest, I don't know anything about this myself. I will be attending this one to find out what this is all about. It sounds fascinating to me. So that one will be November 5th. November 18th, we actually had to do a little bit of juggling of our schedule. You may have noticed some of the dates have changed. November 18th, we're going to be doing Exploring GeoCalc Online. This is for the geodesists, our online repository of projection information, data information. If you're interested in that functionality, take a look at the GeoCalc Online session. And this actually coincides with an update to this tool. So that will be November 18th. There isn't a specific webinar listed, but we will likely have one more kind of shoehorned in before the end of the year, and that's a What's New in Geographic Calculator. Our Geographic Calculator is being updated sometime within the month of November, about mid-November, and we will follow up with a What's New session on that. So there'll be one more moving into the new year. And by the way, you can see the link to where you can get more information, bottom of my screen. Registration obviously is open for these as well. Moving into the new year, we go back to our full day session, GeoTalks 2021. We're putting the final touches on the agenda with all the speakers, I believe, have been lined up. If not, they're fairly close to being lined up. Registration is open. So if you go to the link you see at the bottom of the slide here, you can register for that event. It is free. It's all day. You can attend whatever sections of that day you want. You can use the registration link to come back for a session that may be of interest. We will be releasing the specific agenda, hopefully within the next few days, maybe a few weeks. It shouldn't take too long. And we will send out information about that session. So this is a full day. This is our third annual online GeoTalks. It's essentially our user conference. Lots of guest presenters going to be presenting there as well. So I also want to throw in a quick bullet here. We're talking to some of the folks in our marketing team earlier, and we want to mention the fact that we have an academic scholarship. We've done this a couple of years now. where we've awarded a $500 scholarship to a student. That student would demonstrate their proficiency in Global Mapper through maybe a report or a poster or a project write-up or something of that type using Global Mapper, or at least component of Global Mapper for that workflow. If you want to submit that, deadline for submission is end of next month, and we go through as a committee, we select a deserving winner, and that winner will get a $500 scholarship. So why not? Information, again, on our website, bluemarblegeo.com. You can go to this section where we talk about some of our academic programs, including our academic licensing, but specifically in this case, you can go to that scholarship section to get more information on how you can submit that, or how maybe your students can submit their work. Online training, a lot of stuff coming up. Online training, the final session for 2020, end of November / start of December is going to be our Global Mapper class. That's spread over 5 days, covering everything from an introduction to the software to some of the advanced data analysis procedures. We cram a lot into those sessions. A lot of folks giving very positive feedback on what they learned from those sessions. The following week, we're going to focus on the LiDAR module, including pixels to points. We'll introduce that photogrammetric point cloud generation tool as well. So space is still available as I speak, but you may want to take a look at that and register if you're interested. We do have a limit on how many people will be able to register for those classes. We will be shortly announcing information about our class schedule for 2021. So keep your eye on your inbox or on our website for information about that. Back to today. What are we going to be covering today? Well, we're going to go through the entire process of preparing data for publication. And publication in this context, as I mentioned, is getting ready to print a map. And your printing may actually be generating a PDF. But the first step in that process will be preparation of your data. So we'll go through a few different exercises and how you can clean up your data, perhaps make it visually more appealing. We will then talk about the page layout design process. How do we design the map in a aesthetically pleasing form? Adding data elements. What we're going to do with a number of the workflows we're going to be showing you is bringing up the finished product first so we can see what that looks like, and we'll go back and actually design that ourselves or something comparable to that. So we'll start by designing a simple page layout. The first example will be a poster. We'll also want to talk about labels. The idea of labeling. Labeling is always a difficult one when it comes to presenting data. The positioning of labels, the size of your labels is always something to deal with, and we'll talk about that labeling process and give you some recommendations as to how that can be most effectively applied. So we'll talk about labels in the context of our poster, and then we'll talk about how we can take the basic outline that we have structure that we've generated and save it as a template so that the next time we print a map, maybe your company, your organization, the agency you work for is going to be printing these maps on a repeated basis. You don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. You can use a template as a means to ensure consistency in how you design and how you present your map data. We'll be using some templates a little bit later in our presentation. We'll then shift our focus a little bit, and we'll take a look at the idea of publishing maps, not to a single poster or a single sheet, but rather a map book or an atlas, if you like. You want to use that term. There are tools built into our layout editor that will allow you to design multiple maps based on a target area. And we're going to go through a little scenario illustrating that process. And a slight variation on that theme, we'll also take a look at generating multiple maps, focusing on specific selected areas. So again, this will obviously come into a more meaningful context when we actually show it a little bit later. And finally, as a kind of sequential process through each of these workflows, we'll talk about how we can generate a PDF or indeed hit the print button to send the necessary map to our printer. So that's the plan for today. Mackenzie and I are going to be going back and forth, as I mentioned, going through some of these workflows, introducing the various components that we can add to our printed maps. So let's take a look at our first scenario. Now I'm going to bring up an instance of Global Mapper. We have an outline of the state of Maine here. Our home state, Mackenzie, I think you're a little further north than me, somewhere in this area, if I'm not mistaken. I think is where Mackenzie is. I'm a little further south down by the coast, but this is our home state. This is where Blue Marble is headquartered. On the map currently, we have some town boundaries. Those are the smaller polygons. We have some county boundaries, kind of bolder, darker outlines. We're going to use this as the basis for generating a poster. Now, the poster itself, I thought I had this open, but I don't. If you bear with me for 1 second, I'm going to bring up a finished version of the poster that we're working with. Unfortunately, my windows have all closed here. They decided not to cooperate. So we're going to bring up a PDF, there we go, that will show what we're going to generate. Now you'll see immediately it's a fairly large file here. We're viewing this at 50%, so it's a large format print. This specifically is going to be 24 inches wide, 36 inches tall, poster size here in the US. Let me bring this down to a more manageable view here. Let's go down to 50%, yeah, maybe even smaller now. Let's go down to 25%. Now you can start to see some of the elements that we're going to be adding. So this is the finished product. This is a little bit like a cooking show. We're going to show you the finished dish, and then we'll show you how we prepared it. Now, very simple elements here. We've got a title on our map. We've got the map itself, obviously, with some tick marks denoting lat long values. We have our legend illustrating what we have on the screen, and that's actually step one, is going to be assigning some colors to these features. We've got a few other elements as well. So we'll keep this window open, and when we complete the process, we'll see what that end product would look like. Now, the specific data we're going to be working with for this first illustration is a layer I downloaded from the main office of GIS that denotes the conserved lands in the state, areas that are under some sort of protection. And it's a generic polygon layer, as you can see. If I use my info tool, I'm going to select one of my polygons. I may not actually get one. Let's see, no, I'm selecting my county. Let me actually turn off a couple of layers here just to illustrate this more clearly here. I'll turn off my counties temporarily, turn off my towns, and again, we'll click on a polygon. So here you see all the information. We've got what the name of this is. This is the Bigelow Preserve. It's owned by a paper company. It's public land. There's a fee, and the specific visual representation that I want to apply to the poster we're generating is this field. This denotes who actually administers or owns or runs this particular entity. So each of these polygons is going to have some designation. Hold one type is the name of the attribute. This was inherited from the source data. So I'm going to derive my visualization and by way of preparing this map for printing based on that attribute. I'm going to generate a thematic map. So let me go to full extent again. This is my full view of the state of Maine. And this process requires me to change, obviously, the visual characteristics. I do that by going to the options for this layer, for my conserved lands layer, double click, and I go to the area styles. The area styles are going to use a default appearance. Currently, my polygons are not shaded in any meaningful way. I could change them all consistently to be a distinct color if I just wanted to show the conserved lands without any internal characteristic. That's just a generic color. I can do that by defining the color here, but I want to apply the styling based on an attribute. And that attribute, as I just previewed, is hold one type. That's basically who owns this land or administers this land. Now, from here, I'm going to do something. I'm going to cheat just a little bit because I could manually assign the colors to the appropriate variables here by first loading the values to see what unique values there are, and then manually associating the colors. I've already done this. I'm going to use a style file that I've created previously. I'm going to load that file. And basically what this does is it allows me to predetermine what these colors are, saving that file. We have federal, municipal, private, state, and other. And I assign some colors here, as you can see. This is a useful tool in and of itself. If you're designing some sort of map like this and you expect to encounter the same variables, you don't have to do this manually every time. This is another use of the term template. And we're using a template in this case to define these colors. So I'm just simply going to click OK. And we now have colors assigned. If I were simply administering this map within the context of Global Mapper, I would probably want to put up a legend right here in my page view. But because we're going to actually design a layout for external processes, I'm not interested in doing that. We will deal with the legend and other elements when we actually get into the printing or preprint design process. So how does that work? How do I print a map? We have an option right from the file menu to print. I'm going to make a strong recommendation that you don't take this approach when you're doing a map design. This will simply take a snapshot of your screen without any manual control over your layout. So yeah, don't do this. You can do it. You can simply grab a screenshot and print the map and have a piece of paper. That works fine. Not recommended if you're doing something that we're demonstrating, which is actually a meaningful map layout. For that purpose, you're going to use our dedicated map layout editor. Now, right here in my toolbar is a button I'm going to push that brings up initially a dialog box that lets me define the certain characteristics of this map. I can decide, for instance, my paper size. Well, I know already I'm going to design a map that's poster sized. So we'll use this drop down and we'll choose from the available paper sizes. Right at the bottom here, we have 24 inches by 36. It is a portrait alignment. In other words, height taller than it is wide. That works perfectly in this situation. I can define the bounds for this map, and I can define the scale as well, except I can only define one of these, because if I choose the bounds, the scale is going to have to follow automatically. I know the extent of my map, I know the page size, I have no control over the scale. If scale is something I want to control, I change those options. I choose a scale, manually put in the scale. In that case, I can't stipulate the extent of my map. So you can choose one of these, but not both. In my case, I'm more interested in the bounds than the scale. Now, the bounds is going to default to the extent of your data, but there's a few different options. How much of my map do I want to print? I can define this based on a polygon. Maybe I would have a polygon saying this is my map outline extent. If I know the lat long extent, I can manually enter those values. I can manually draw a box, which is what I typically do in most of my situations, print this area. Or I can use the extent of an existing layer. Now, I do actually have a bounds layer in my control center. I'm going to use the extent of that, even though it's not visible. It's a single polygon that I created for this purpose, and I'm going to use the layer bounds for that layer to define the extent of my map. You could obviously use the extent of one of the layers you're printing as well. The issue with that may be that it will abut itself precisely to the extent. So I'm giving myself a little bit of a buffer around the edge of my map using this process. And you can see, by the way, that yellow outline indicating the extent of the map that will be printed. So with those settings applied, we simply click OK, nothing else to change yet. Oh, one thing I should mention, if we had done this previously, if I'd gone through the process of designing this layout, putting a heading in here, determining where our legend was going to be located, maybe putting a logo for our company at the bottom, I wouldn't have to do that again manually, because we are about to do it manually, but instead I can use a template that I would previously have saved. In a few minutes, we're going to show you how you can save a template from a design that you've applied to your map data. But because this is the first time, we're going to go with the manual process. We'll click OK. And it immediately brings up a second map view. It's a floating window that replicates the display in my main map, but in a design context. You'll see little rulers are here denoting, in this case, it's inches, my 24 inches by 36 inches, and we'll see the map now displayed within that context. I'm going to dock this side by side. I'm actually going to make it a little bit larger here, so something to look at, because we will be interacting with the main map as well in just a few minutes. But primarily, what we're going to do is we're going to add various elements to our map display to essentially replicate what we saw in this final product: legend, scale bar, some lat long tick marks, etc., etc. And again, we're going to do this manually. Mackenzie, do you want to tell us a little bit about the first element, which is actually the map itself?
Yes. So what we have here, as David said, it's more of a layout view for our map. We've got our page with its defined size, and we already have an element on this page here. If we select that box bounding the map, that is our first element showing our data. And you can click and drag to move this around and resize it from the corners or the sides, as David is showing. And that allows you to, finely tune and position that map. Now, there are other methods to do this, and you can edit some other properties associated with this first map element that we have. So right-clicking on the element, we can go to Properties to open that window. And on this first tab, the map view, we see that we do have our bounds described. If we wanted to, we could switch and draw using a fixed scale, but we'll stick with our defined bounds for now. On the next tab over, we have options for a grid frame. So this is to add tick marks with some, projection intervals. So we're going to add some tick marks to give us a little geographic reference on this map. We'll add latitude, longitude tick marks along the edge of our frame here. And we'll stick with the automatic spacing, which will space those evenly along the frame. You do have the option to specify a custom interval in arc degrees for the latitude longitude grid. We'll keep our tick mark color as black, and we'll change the orientation to parallel. So our text will go parallel to our map frame grid that we have.
And this will probably be dictated by how much space you have around the edge. And obviously being parallel, the tick marks along the edge will be up down basically. So it depends on how much space you have and much clarity you want in terms of how these are represented. So.
And then we will click to align the labels with the tick marks so they're not side by side. I think we have enough room on our map that we can stack those labels right on top of those tick marks. And we can click apply. Without closing the property windows, that will apply that those tick marks, that grid frame, to our map view here. You can see them starting to appear. Again, this is a large poster size, so we may need to increase the font for our tick points. Maybe 20-point font would be a better size, a little more readable. And click apply, and we see that those now update.
And I should stress as well, you're looking at a poster here. So yeah, the text at this scale may not look readable. Don't worry about that. This is a high-level overview. A little bit later, we'll show zooming in for the purpose of fine-tuning the position, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
So moving on to the next tab of this properties windows, we do have a general tab which defines the frame for our map. We will keep a frame on this element. That's that black border line that our tick marks are coming off of. We got a little preview of the style there. You can choose to edit this, maybe add a background color for your data area or change the border style. And then unchecking the draw frame on element box will completely remove that black border frame there. And then finally, we have position and size. And this is another method, as opposed to the clicking and dragging the map on the page view. We can fine tune the position and size for our map. So we know with our paper size 24 by 36, we'll make our map data with some specific dimensions. We'll do 20 inches in width and 27 for height. And we can click apply, and that adjusts the size of our data element here. Now we can go ahead and close the properties window. We have some options set there, and this map looks fairly centered left to right in our view, but to ensure that, we can right click, go to align on margin, and choose center to align left right, and then again the same option, middle, to align that data frame in the vertical on our page. So that perfectly centers our data, our first map element onto our page here.
A quick visual check here to see the final product, and it looks comparable. It looks like you've done a great job so far, designing a presentable map here. Excellent.
So the next few things we'll add are some additional map elements. We have our data displayed, that's great, but we need a little more information on this map as we're seeing in the final product. Namely, we need a title for our map. So to do that, we can right click on the page and choose to insert a text element.
And just while we're here, before we make this selection, you see, we will obviously visit some of these and maybe describe a few of the others, but this process of adding additional elements now allows you to control the content. You can do it by right-clicking. There's also an insert menu option here, which will do the same thing. So a number of different ways to do this. There's also a button in the toolbar, lets you add additional elements.
So this is generated a text box, and we have to enter the text that we choose to use here. We are going to name this map Maine Conserved Lands. Down below the area to enter the text, we do have an option to select macro, and this lets you set sort of a variable based on some information that can be derived from the data or map that you have loaded. So maybe you want to insert some projection information, and that will pull it straight from the information Global Mapper has, so you don't manually have to type that out.
Yeah, and we will actually be using macros a little bit later for one of our other scenarios where we automate the generation of text. We don't have to manually create it. So very, very useful tool.
Especially if you're making multiple maps, which we will see later when we do use some macros. We can select our font, maybe make our title a bigger style here. 72 point, I believe, is good for our poster size. and make that a bold font. And then for our justification in the text box, we'll choose to justify center and click OK. Oh, David's reminding me, we do want to remove that black frame box around our title so the text just floats in space without being bound by a box there. So we can go ahead and uncheck to draw the frame on element. And we should be all set now.
Yeah, you could put that. I mean, we're making some very specific settings here. There's no requirement, obviously. If you want to have your title, bounded by a box, or even you can define the style just to having a background, maybe a subtle background to accentuate it. If it's sitting on top of maybe imagery, if your map extent goes to the edge of your border, you may want to have that frame to kind of make it pop a little bit. So you can be creative in how you use this, but obviously in our case, we're going to put our title right at the top, so we don't need to have that frame displayed.
And we can position our title by dragging and then use the right-click method again to align that to the center. Perfectly center that on the top of our page here.
So what you're starting to see here are these various elements can be manually picked up and dragged to assign them to an optimal location, or you can specify exactly where they are in your layout. You can also use the arrow keys on your keyboard. You'll notice I'm tweaking that. You're kind of seeing a little bit of the text moving. So I think I messed up your work here, Mackenzie, but you're seeing we're tweaking that text incrementally. So you have control over the position using various options. I'll bring it back to the center again. So perfectly aligned. So we now know our map is perfectly aligned. We know our text is perfectly aligned.
Yeah, so again, we can add another map element here. From the insert menu, next we'll add an image element. So we want the main state logo here. So this will have to choose our file.
So you can just see in the file, this is basically any image file can be added to your layout. Some examples where you may want to do this creatively, or perhaps you have a 3D capture, or if you're doing some terrain data, you may have a 3D map. You can insert the 3D view, the oblique perspective from Google Mappers 3D view as an image and have that as an insert in your map view. So you can be very creative. This image will literally load any type of image and allow you, again, to position it appropriately.
Yeah, maybe an image of a graph or something would be useful for some data here. But we'll add the main state seal, just a small logo we'll put in the corner. Under the general tab, images by default do not have that frame, and we will keep that without a frame. Click OK, and we see that image comes in a much larger size than we would like. So we can resize that manually by clicking and dragging on the corner, or we can go to the properties for the image, go to the position and size tab and make that, let's say, 2 inches by 2 inches. Fit nicely in the bottom corner there. Click OK, and we can drag that image down to its approximate position. Again, we'll zoom in and fine tune some of these positions in a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, obviously another very important element here that we'll need to add to this layout is a legend. We've gone to the extent of differentiating these polygons in our original map view, in the 2D map view. We want to describe what they are. We want a legend. This is a very simple one. Again, I've used a couple of different methods for inserting. We use the menu, we use the right click. We also have this option, add a layout element, your choice. I mean, you've got a button, you've got a menu, you've got a right click. I'm gonna use the right click here, insert. And in this case, we're going to do a map legend element. This is similar. Those of you who have used the desktop or the workspace version of legend assignment, this is similar. You choose what your legend is going to be applied to. In my case, it's going to be applied to my loaded vector data. So I'm going to choose that option. Vector types. Now, if you note here, I have a base map that has the towns. I have another base map that has my counties, actually. I don't want them in my legend. They're not relevant. I really want to focus specifically on the polygon. So I'm going to filter my layers. First thing I'm going to do is define which of the layers that are present that are going to be in my legend, just to conserve lands layer. So main towns, main counties, you can forget about those in my legend. I'm not interested. Other options here, we can define what the label is that is applied to our legend. In our case, it's going to be the same label that the same attribute that defined the colors, which is our hold one type attribute. That's good to go. We can make this a multi-column legend if we have multiple options to display. Not relevant in our case. We know there are only 5, so that sits nicely in one column. Other options here to define it based on the map bounds, sorting options in here, filtering by type, as well as filtering by layer, not relevant in our case. And there's a couple of additional settings to determine the text. Now, first of all, do I want to put a header? Very often, if the title of your map defines what's in the map itself, you don't need necessarily a heading for your legend. It's implied in what the map is called. In our case, that's not the case. The title of the map is Main Conserved Lands. There's no designation in that as to what the colors represent. So I won't want to put a header. I'm just going to type the word ownership. Or something to designate, in this case, who runs this property or who administers this property. Ownership is going to be the heading. The font, just glancing at my notes, make sure I get the right size. And this is very often in the real world, or the world in which you're designing, trial and error. Assign a font. If it doesn't look good, you can replace it. You can apply some other font size. We're going to go with 36 point type, and the font for the legend itself, the style of the labels that are applied to each of these, we're going to define a font for that as well, slightly smaller. Let's do 28 points in this case. Click OK. And this is really all we need. Once again, this general tab is basically the map frame. Do I want a map frame? Yes, in this case I do. This is going to be a floating element within my map view. I want it to be bounded by a box. So that should stay. We'll click OK. It positions it in a generic location. I can drag it around again. There's no alignment required here. I'll have this position wherever I want, wherever I drag it. And you'll notice it does require expanding just a little bit. You can expand it from the corners. You can expand it left and right to get to a point where it's aesthetically pleasing. Just as an FYI, I wouldn't assume that this view is actually going to be the final view. My recommendation, if you're doing this, is to zoom in. Zoom in to the extent where you're actually seeing the map and its print size, then fine tune the elements. And we'll do that in just a second with the various elements we're working with here. I think I just moved your map view. Let me recenter it again. There we go. So yeah, we will fine tune some of the positions of these elements in just a second. Scale bar. Again, right click, insert, scale bar. We're obviously not going to go into all of the details here, but we can specify the spacing of our scale bar. In this case, I am actually going to define that our scale distance, our tick marks in our scale bar are going to be specifically 10 kilometers. You can miles, meters, whatever is relevant. And you can also define based on that specified distance, which are going to be labeled. And this again requires trial and error. If your tick mark spacing are too close and you choose to label all of your tick marks, you may have text overlapping text. You may want to label every other tick mark, or automatic, in which case the tick marks will be labeled where there is space available. In my case, I'm going to label every other tick mark. And the size of the scale can be dictated simply by dragging the box. You'll see that in just a second. Once again, do we want to frame? Yes, we do in this case. We'll click OK. And don't worry about what it looks like from this perspective. We're looking at a wide perspective, but I'm going to position it down here in the bottom corner. And I'm going to widen it just a little bit. Now, what's interesting about the scale bar is that if you resize the map, the scale bar will automatically adjust to reflect that size. You don't have to worry about designing or positioning a scale bar at a certain point in time and that being invalid if you resize your map. It will always reflect the current map size. A question came in about north arrow. Yes, we can put a north arrow. That's again one of these design elements. Place a north arrow. I'm not going to do it in our case, but you can position a north arrow. There's various visualization options. Can use a double grid frame, both lat long and projected. Not in this dialog box, no. But if you actually want to put the lines themselves, you may want lines on your map that maybe reflect projected coordinates. You can do that as an option in the 2D map view and have those lines actually printed and have your tick marks reflect lat long values. But that's a very good question, something we may take a look at to see if that's something for a future version of this, if we will allow both lat long and projected coordinates within the same frame. But as of right now, that's not the case. Final element I want to add here, don't want to squeeze too much on our time, is some text. Some text that I've actually captured from the website from where I downloaded this data. I'm going to right click, I'm going to insert a text element once again. In this case, it's not going to be a heading, but rather I'm going to put, remember the one with clipboard, thankfully it worked. This is just text that I copied from the metadata from this file, just describing the data. In this case, I'm going to be left justified. I do want to keep a border in this case, that works. We're not changing the style in any of these borders, but we could if we wanted. And my font in this case we will make 20 point. And then this was done just again based on trial and error, and we'll click OK and click OK once again. And you'll see my box containing my text now displayed at the bottom of my screen. Adjusting the text box obviously adjusts the alignment of my text. So those are just some examples of elements that we can add to the map view. Now, as promised, it makes sense in terms of positioning to zoom in. We have zoom tools right within the interface here. Zoom in, zoom out. We have panning tools as well. These are similar, or the same basically, as we have in the standard view in Global Mapper. So if I want to zoom in a little closer to fine tune some of these elements, you simply hit the zoom button and it'll refresh my view. I'm not sure how this is refreshing on the on-screen or the stream view. Hopefully your screen is refreshing. You can start to get a closer perspective and you can start to see the actual font size and how that appears, and you can start to see the individual elements. It looks like this box is probably a little bigger than it needs to be. I can adjust my legend box, for instance. I can adjust my scale now. I can see my scale, maybe make some changes. I can right-click, go to properties if my scale doesn't work. I can look at my text box at the bottom, see how well it aligns with the logo. Does the logo align with the edge of my print view? Maybe I want to tweak them. Maybe I want to select my logo, hold the control button down or shift button down, control button, I'm sorry, and select the map view. We then have options for aligning them. We can align those elements along their right sides, their left sides, their centers. In our case, obviously the right side would make most sense. I've tweaked my legend in so it's now perfectly aligned with the edge of my map. Similarly, we could align the text box with my logo here, making sure it, again, perfectly justified along the bottom. I'm not going to do that, but all manner of options in terms of making sure the positioning of these elements is precise and clean and looks aesthetically pleasing. Any other elements, Mackenzie, that we've missed? We mentioned the north arrow.
I think we've added all but the north arrow in this map here. You can add multiple map elements. For example, we have 2 text boxes here. You could add multiple images for your map if you need more description from that. And of course, a north arrow is relevant in some cases. We did have a few questions come in, one about setting the map to a specific scale. And at the beginning, when we went to set up our map layout here, you did have the option to assign a specific scale to the map, but also right-clicking on the map frame and on this map view element properties that David has open, we can draw using a fixed scale. And this may affect the bounds of the data being shown because the scale is then incorporated with the page size to determine how much data can be shown in the area.
Yeah, and if you have a requirement, that's a setting you would likely have applied during the initial setup of this outline. So yeah, but you can do it after the fact, as you can see here. 2 options, bounds and scale. They're one or other. You can't do both, as Mackenzie implied. You cannot do both. One other thing to note here, we mentioned this at the start. If having spent a little more time, taking a little more care to actually design this effectively, we wanted to save this as something we apply to additional maps. Maybe I'm designing another map with main parks or something, and I don't want to have to go through all these steps again. Having done this work once, save the template. And that template would be something you would then load in that first dialog box that we saw. Instead of defining the page size, defining the scale, just load the template. Everything's pre-built for you except for the map. The map itself will be driven from what it sees on your current screen, but everything else will already be there. So you definitely have that option. Now, I'm going to keep chugging along here because I also want to talk about labels. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on labeling. We don't have any labels for any of these features, but let's say for my map, I wanted to denote the names of each of these counties. There are, what, 16, am I right, Mackenzie? 16 counties in Maine?
Yes, 16.
Thank you, 16. I think everybody in Maine should know that. I'm a recent arrival, so maybe I haven't quite graduated to that level yet. I'm going to close this view, by the way. We can remove this display and open it up later. It will remember all of these elements, but I'm going to go back to the main map view and talk a little bit about labels. There are no labels obviously displayed now. I want to choose my counties layer and I want to apply labels specifically to that layer. Double click to bring up the options. Let's go to our labels tab and I'm going to generate labels based on one of the attributes. The attribute happens to be pre-selected, which is the county name itself. So this works perfectly. I also want to create a separate label layer. This is something we added fairly recently that allows you to individually manipulate the labels that are applied to features. Rather than embedding the labels in a single layer, we create a separate layer. And this works perfectly for this scenario that we're going to be working with here. I'll click OK, and I'll just make sure I link the label to the attribute table. That works. It will position the labels at the geometric center of each polygon. Now, labels inherently will be defined by a point size. I could have defined that initially, but what that means basically is my label will maintain its size relative to my screen, but not to the geographic features themselves. So one thing you may want to do, in fact, I strongly encourage you, is to define a specific size for the labels that are going to be printed. And the way you can do that is by converting a point size to a linear unit height for each letter in your label. The options for my newly formed labels layer, double click or turn off. You can see my labels here. Double click. I'm going to specify the style for all of my labels, in which I am going to say not my labels aren't going to be a certain point size, but rather they're going to be based on a height in fixed ground units, on the ground, quite literally. How high is the W in Washington going to be? Trial and error, I've done this already. I'm going to make these 5,000 meters, 5 kilometer tall letters. Now what that means is that when I apply this size to my labels, they will maintain that size regardless of my zoom level. So I can position the labels very precisely in preparation for printing. We'll click OK. Slightly smaller from my current perspective, but now you'll note as I zoom in on a label, hopefully my screen is refreshing fast enough, you'll see that text in a relative sense enlarges. Also, the fact that I have now a separate label layer, I have options for manually manipulating these labels. I can override the appearance or override the position. I can select the label and say, you know what, it's sitting right on a polygon here. I'm going to select it, and I'm going to use the move function. I'm going to move it to a new location. You'll notice snapping tries to snap it to some of the vertices. That may or may not be something you want. In fact, in this case, probably not. A quick shortcut here, if you're using this function yourself, hold the Alt button down while you're moving, and that temporarily disables the snapping function, allowing you to position a label much more precisely. Now, if I had the time, I would go through every label, reposition it. Obviously, this one is sitting in the wrong location, probably not the right location. I'm going to move this guy down a little bit here. Again, holding my Alt button down so it doesn't snap, and you can see it's nicely positioned within the polygon. I'm not going to do any others. But if I open up the layout editor once again, it maintains what I've done before and adds the additional labels which are now applied to the map. Difficult to see them, but they are here. Maybe zooming a little closer, you'll see them. Benefit of this approach to labeling is those text boxes, so text is going to be a precise, predetermined size. So definitely worth the effort to change your label height, not based on a point, but based on a linear unit. Now, final thing I'm going to do with this scenario, and we're probably going to run out of time, we may go a little long today. What we're going to do here is change the appearance of the polygons. Perhaps we're not seeing the polygons emphasized enough, the county outlines. I can change those in real time, and again, they'll be reflected in real time on the map. So double click my counties layer. This is just going back to the area styles. We're going to use the same style for all of our features. This is not the preserved lands, the colors. This is the boundaries of the counties. We'll just make them, rather than 1 pixel, I'm going to make these 2 pixels. And you should, again, see that in real time in my print layout. Click OK. Click OK again. And you'll see they're a little bit bolder now, both on the main map view, but also in this outline or this printed map. So that is example 1 of a layout, designing a layout for a poster. Needless to say, if we were ready to go, we file, we export to a geospatial PDF. This is a PDF that retains its geographic intelligence. So it can be, you can interact with it from a geographic perspective. In Acrobat, for instance, you can measure based on ground units. But it is a PDF, can be printed, can be migrated into another application, or you can go direct to print and print it to your plotter. If you have a plotter in your office, you've got a poster, which would look ultimately like this. Okay, let's close this and let's bring up a different workspace. I'm going to unload. I'm not going to save any of the changes. By the way, the layout would be saved in your workspace in Global Mapper. If this is something you want to do yourself and you want to go home for the day, pick it up tomorrow, it will remember all the settings you applied. I'm not going to save in this case, so unfortunately all the work that McKinsey and I have done is now gone. I'm going to bring up another workspace. Slightly different approach to map printing here. Rather than printing a poster, we're going to design a multi-page layout. Now for this example, this is a small area of some topographic data. This happens to be a GeoPDF showing, again, area of the state of Maine. This is Acadia National Park along the coast of Maine. Great area for hiking and biking and all sorts of fun stuff. What we want to do in this scenario is design a map book. We want to design a pocket-sized book that we can put in our backpack with all of the trails, all the contours, all the topographic information. We don't want a sheet map. We don't want a poster. We have no room for a poster, but we want a map book. So we're going to go through the process of that design process. Mackenzie, you want to guide us through this one?
I would love to. So again, we'll click to set up our map layout editor from the toolbar up top. This is also available from the tools menu in the main view of Global Mapper. But this time we will be using a template to set up our layout options. So again, we've created a map similar to this or a map like this before, and we've saved a template, Acadia, as our map template, and we'll choose to open that template file to start designing our map. And we'll set the bounds as opposed to a specified scale, and we'll select this based on the layer bounds. We do have a bounds layer, just a simple rectangular feature in our workspace here. We'll select that layer to use for our map bounds. We'll click OK, and that should set up our first page in our map layout editor. Now again, this is just the first page. The goal here is to create a map book. As you can see from this page layout, our margins or our page size is a lot smaller. We're about 4.5 by 5.5. So about a quarter size of a standard letter page. Maybe we're printing this out and folding up our little map book. But we'll use a create map book tool in order to generate the rest of our pages, our tiled atlas pages here. So clicking on the create map book option, we will use the current layout from the map layout editor. We could choose to use a saved template, but since we already initialized that template in the generation of our first page here, we can use our current template. And we'll go to the tiling tab. And this is where we'll set up how much data is displayed on each page. We will create a tile definition by specifying a number of columns. You can specify a number of columns or number of rows here. Whichever you do not specify is determined by the map extent that you're choosing to tile. And we'll set some overlap for our tiles. So there's a little overlap between our pages here, 5% of our tile size. And on the Export Bounds tab, we can choose to reset our map bounds, but we're going to use our current layout template bounds. So the bounds from our first page here, that will be what we are tiling to create our next pages for our map book. Click OK, and we should see those pages generate. So it looks like we've got 5 by 5 tiles here. And as David just clicks through some of these pages, you can see that they're a zoomed in closer look at the data that we have represented. You know, that topographic information and then the trails layer we have laid over as well.
Yeah, and you'll see that defined by that overlap. That's, you know, in this type of publication, you don't want the map to abut right on the edge. You see the H here, looks like the beginning of a name. If we go to the adjacent map, you'll see the overlap. This is Huguenot Head here. So you're getting that transition. You're not having a hard border. And having worked in cartography in a past life, this is essential for this type of publication. You don't want to end the map right on the edge of the page. You want a little continuation on the adjacent page.
So if we go to the index page, we just get a good view of our different tiles corresponding to what page in our map book they represent. You can see that there is some overlap between those tiles. But right in the middle, we have our full extent labeled as page 1. Now to remove that, we'll go up to the first page in our layout here and right click, I believe, to change some settings here and choose not to include this in the map layout index. So uncheck that box, and that should remove that page 1 label from our index. So we're just labeling our smaller tiles on our index page here.
And certainly this first page that was generated was a requirement for us to get into the dialog box. You may not even need this now. There may be situations where you've got your index page, which is kind of your overview. You've got the individual pages. That's what I'm printing. That's what I'm going to put in my little map book. Page 1 doesn't really have any function. You can remove it. You can delete it from your what would be printed. We'll talk about that, I think, in our next little scenario in just a few minutes.
But for this example, since we do have this first page, sort of a nice overview of the area that we have represented on our subsequent pages, we're going to use this as a cover for our little map book. Some elements that we do not need on the cover would be the scale bar, and then we have a page number in the other corner. So we can go ahead and just select and delete those elements. So we're just seeing the map overview. And then in order to overlay a text title, we're gonna set some transparency to our map here. So again, selecting the element, going to properties, and then under general, we can choose to set transparency. So a little under 50%, and that fades out our background map. Great opportunity to put some text and other information on top of it. So we'll add a text element. And this is a hiking guide to Acadia National Park.
You make me type a lot here. ACADIA.
I'll wait for you to catch up.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to abbreviate National Park to NP.
And we can select the font for this. I don't know, maybe 12 might be good, maybe 14. We'll see. Again, this is sort of a trial and error situation.
And you can see you can keep the window open to tweak some of these settings, tweak the appearance so it makes it look like you want. I believe in this case we'll probably remove the frame. We don't really need the frame in this case.
Yep, and then on the text we can center the text in the box and then use our align options from the right click to center our text box in the space.
Perfect. We now have a title page for our little book, and we have an index page following, and then we have the individual maps. So we're starting to see the creation of this publication. We're publishing a map. Now, this is obviously done very quickly and on the fly, but if you're doing this yourself, any data can be segmented up in this using this process. You don't want a full sheet map of your project area. You want to break it up into manageable areas with the appropriate overlap. You can absolutely do the same thing here. It doesn't necessarily need to be something you print. It just can be individual maps covering your area of interest. And Mackenzie, I'm going to suggest we do a little more aesthetic addition here. I'm going to put a 3D map of this area. I have an image that I captured using the 3D view in Global Mapper. I'm going to add that to my map view. Acadia 3D, click open. No other settings needed here. It's just going to pop an image here. There we go. That's a nice addition to our main view. And once again, by selecting both of these, holding your control button down, we can make sure that they're perfectly aligned. You also note here we can make them the same size, width, height, or both if that's relevant, not in our case, but let's align them on their centers. And there we go, nicely spaced, nicely aligned. I think we're ready to print here. I think you did a great job. By the way, the macro that we applied here, or the, not macro, I'm sorry, the template, really all it did is apply a scale and a page number. That's what was generated in the template. And you see each of these page numbers are automatically assigned. So we've got a little index from our maps, and we can go straight to page 16 because that's got the trail that we're going to be walking on today. Okay. We're almost out of time, but I want to embellish this process just a little bit by showing a slight variation on this workflow. Mackenzie, I assume you're done. You happy with your hiking trail book, Mackenzie?
Happy with the hiking trail book, ready to hit the trail today.
Ready to hit the trails, good. I'll hit the print button and I'll meet you at the trailhead. We're going to unload this workspace, final workspace, very quickly here. A variation on that theme. We're going to go back to the data we worked with first. But in this case, I don't want to generate a poster. Rather, what I want to do is generate an individual map for each of these counties. I'm going to basically use the same process that Mackenzie did, but instead of using tiles, pre-existing tiles, I'm going to base my individual maps based on features that I have pre-selected. So first thing I'm going to do is go through the standard, what we've done a few times now, opening up our layout editor. Once again, Well, in this case, I actually had it preloaded in this workspace. I'd forgotten. So this is actually something that was already assigned. It's standard 8.5 by 11 US letter size paper. Really, this map has no relevance in this context. It just enables me to get into this view and see the extent of my data in the layout. Because what I'm going to do back in the 2D map is to define what those individual tiles are. And for this, I'm going to use my counties. The counties is an individual vector layer here. And we know, based on Mackenzie's confirmation, there are 16 polygons here. I'm going to select that layer and select all the features. Basically, I've highlighted all the counties. Because they're selected in my 2D map now, I can come back over to my layout and say, rather than creating a map book based on those tiles that Mackenzie showed us, I'm going to create a feature map book. In other words, designating an individual page based on the extent of each feature. So simple button to click in the toolbar. Few settings here. Do we want to include the tile bounds? Yes, we do. That's what Mackenzie showed us with that index page. We want the same here. Although, to be honest, in this context, it's a little bit more difficult to see what's going on because there is a lot of overlap. But we'll leave that enabled at the start. No, we want the legend to appear in this case. So we would apply the legend. In fact, to make this a little simpler, I've actually designed a template for each of these anyway. I didn't bring up the PDF showing the final result of this, but believe me, we have a final version that has individual elements already added. So I'm going to choose that template. It's called counties. And I'll show you when we finish this what was contained in that template. We'll see that in just a second. Feature options, we don't really need to worry about the extent in this case. All I'm going to do once again is define a buffer. Rather than abutting each of my individual pages to the precise outline of my counties, I want to extend them just a little bit. 5% works. Everything else should be fine here. We'll click OK. And once again, we get individual pages. The name that's assigned is driven from the label that we had previously assigned to each page. So that is what is contained within each map view. My index page, as you see, is a little bit difficult to understand because each county has its own bounding rectangle that defines the extent. They're not the same, unlike with Mackenzie's where we had individually sized tiles. If I go to one of the counties, you'll see it redraws my map to the extent. And these are the elements that I had added for the template. By the way, I have an additional layer here, the layer I created with my labels. I want to turn that off so it will not appear on my legend. So I don't need labels on this map because each layer, each individual page, has the elements that are required. Main conserved lands was some text I added, my scale bar, my legend, my seal. I added these all to the bottom of my screen. I got my lat long tick marks, but each map is different. The scale is going to reflect that individual map. Also, the name of the county changes for each one. There's Knox County, there's Lincoln County. How did I do that automatically? Well, I did that using a macro. This is what we described earlier. I'm going to go to the properties of that text element, and this is the macro. I'm going to use the title of the map, which again is driven from the fact that these were all labeled, and I added the word county. It's a manual text string. By applying that macro, it automatically generates this text for me. I didn't have to manually go in and type Lincoln County, Sagadahoc County, etc., etc. But the bottom line here is I end up with an array of pages defined by the extent of each of these individual counties within which there's a legend, within which there's the seal, etc., etc. This is an example of the use of a macro, but also an example of the use of a pre-configured template to save an awful lot of work in designing each of these individual maps. And I can print these each individually, have them in a publication, have them on my wall of my office, whatever I need. So slight variation on what Mackenzie had shown us with the tile outline. Here it's driven by selected features. Had I only selected maybe one or two of the counties, again, those would have been the maps that would have been contained within this layout. So it gives you a lot of flexibility in terms of how your data is presented. Lots of questions came in. We had a chance to answer just a few, with apologies. Obviously, we had a lot to try to cram into our time here. Those questions that came in that we did not have a chance to answer, don't worry. We will get you answers in email. You'll also see, as I mentioned at the start, you'll see a blog post. You'll get a link to that hopefully within the next few days. And you can see all of the questions that were answered, and you can see all the responses as well. For today, I believe that is all we have time for. We've reached the top of the hour, so pretty much hit all the bullets here. initially preparing our data for publication. We talked about layouts. We talked about the labeling process, templates. We showed how a template can be applied, and then variations on our map book before ultimately generating our geospatial PDF. We didn't actually do that. We showed you the pre-created version. If you have questions on Global Mapper or questions about what we covered today you weren't able to answer, or maybe you're watching the recording and you have questions, please use the email that you see here. If you want information on our licensing, how your company can deploy Global Mapper, orders at bluemarblegeo.com. The folks in our sales area will be more than happy to answer those questions. Any more technical questions, such as the ones we've been looking at coming in today, you can ask those of geohelp at bluemarblegeo.com. I would request that you reference that you saw something in this presentation, and that will help the folks on our tech team respond appropriately. If you're new to Global Mapper, and I know a lot of you here have not used Global Mapper, we went a little deep today in some of the functionality, but a more general perspective of some of the capabilities. You want to set up a trial, or indeed you want to do maybe a one-on-one presentation for your company with some of the folks on our tech team, bluemarblegeo.com/trial. You can request, again, a trial of the software or a demo of the software, a one-on-one demo. So, Mackenzie, thank you so much for your help today. This was a little bit of a kind of a interesting ride. Went back and forth a little bit, but thank you for lending your expertise once again.
I'm always happy to help.
Excellent. Folks, we will see you in I believe a couple of weeks. Our next one is a couple of weeks on the holographic do. Please sign up with that one. That sounds interesting. I will be joining you for that one. One of my colleagues will be delivering that. So, and again, don't forget the full day GeoTalks starting January 20, towards the end of January. You can sign up for that full day of presentations as well. But for today, folks, thanks for joining us, and we'll speak to you next time.